Good evening. I'm glad to see you all here this evening. It's my privilege to welcome you all and our participants to this evening's discussion on God Talk, Religious Speech in Public Discourse. My name is Nathan Chapman. I'm a student at the law school here. It's not so often that we get the opportunity to listen to folks discuss and chat and listen to one another about an issue that's rather divisive in our society. Too often we get hit with sound bites and talk show pundits and whatnot who are really talking past one another rather than with one another and listening to one another. Hopefully tonight's event is a brief remedy of that and serves as a model for future stuff. Let me introduce our participants. Dr. Stanley Hauerwas, to my immediate left, is the Gilbert T. Rowe Professor of Theological Ethics at Duke Divinity School. He holds a joint appointment at the law school. His work focuses on the role of the church as a witness to Jesus and as developing the theological virtues in the lives of Christians. To his left is Dr. J.D. Greear, who has been the lead pastor at the Summit Church here in Durham since 2002. He has a doctorate in systematic theology from Southeastern, and before his tenure at Summit began, he served for a couple of years in Southeast Asia as a missionary. Directly to his left is Professor Howard Lesnick. Professor Lesnick has taught at the University of Pennsylvania Law School since 1960. He is the Jefferson B. Fordam Professor of Law there now and teaches and writes on professional responsibility and the intersection of law and religion. To his left is someone who I think is ideally suited to moderate this evening's discussion, our own Dr. Jeff Powell, Professor of Law and Theology at the Duke Law School and Duke Divinity School. Thank you very much to each of you for being here. We're glad to have you. Thank you, audience, for being here. I hope you enjoy it. And one last thanks needs to go to Chris Schrader, Dana Norvell, and Balfour Smith for making this happen in basically every way. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you, Nathan. Let me add my personal welcome to the panelists and to you in the audience. And just a word about format. We'll begin with a couple of questions that, although I will, if no one immediately jumps in, name somebody to begin responding, but they are general questions that we hope everyone, all three of the panelists, will want to respond to. After that, we'll have a question which was designed particularly for for one of the individual panelists, but we hope the other two will be interested in responding as well. And then we'll have time for questions from you, and I hope there will be a lot. Okay, the first question is as follows. The ghost of the philosopher John Rawls haunts the landscape of American public discourse. Rawls suggested that arguments capable of producing universal assent should be substituted for religious arguments in public debate. This argument has been taken to heart by religious and non-religious leaders alike. Under Rawls's theory, policy arguments based on religious belief fuel discord because such arguments are inherently sectarian and inherently irrational. Dr. Wendy Doniger, a Chicago Divinity School professor, recently wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post that Rawls might be proud of. She wrote, "I pledge allegiance to the First Amendment, which I interpret to mean that government shouldn't traffic with religion, neither promote it nor persecute it. And this means that in the public arena, the candidate should not use religious rhetoric which does nothing but harm. Of course, religious or non-religious beliefs will play an important part in candidates' judgments about a whole host of policy issues, but those judgments must stand, and they must be judged on their own merits, regardless of what beliefs underlie them." The question for the three panelists, and Dr. Greear, if you could lead us off. Do arguments from religious conviction, because such arguments are inherently irrational, unnecessarily exacerbate sectarian division in the United States and prevent meaningful public discourse?
First I would like to say I have a 3-year-old daughter, and she's into these games now where you have to pick out in the picture what doesn't belong. And I think she would have no problem looking at this table up here and figuring out who doesn't belong here. The distinguished gentlemen to my right and to my left are two people that I have admired and familiar with their work. They are part of the distinguished academic cultures of both the University of Pennsylvania and the who's who crowd of Duke academia. They're part of the who's who crowd. I am more part of the who's he crowd. I realize that. I know that in many ways my role in this is I represent evangelicals, which is an increasingly vocal and scrutinized group in politics. And I know that for some of you that makes me the village idiot, and part of that reputation may be well-deserved because some evangelicals seem to talk like all the founding fathers were Southern Baptists who wrote the Constitution during a tent revival service. So I hope to better represent evangelical thought on the matter. I would also like to commend Nathan and the other architects of this particular event, because at least from the perspective I come from, the evangelical culture, there is a desperate need for this type of dialogue. There is a great little book called Evangelicals in the Public Square by an author named Jay Budichevsky, or Jay Pachevsky. I'm not really sure how to pronounce his name. I guess around Duke here it could be just Coach B. But in the book, he makes the point that evangelicals have never really had a good comprehensive approach to the subject. It's always reactionary. His 4 figures that he identifies, Francis Schaeffer, Carl F. H. Henry, Abraham Kuyper, and John Yoder, are all people that reacted to a certain culture they were in. He says, but nobody's ever really thought it through. And so I think this kind of thing is very good. With the question in particular, my problem with Dr. Doniger and others like her that make the assertions that she does is that I think she poses a logical impossibility, if I could say it that brashly, of being able to evaluate issues and laws while abstaining from religious reasoning. She wants the public square to remain naked of religious rhetoric because she thinks it's inherently unfair. But laws are based on values, and values are almost always based on a metaphysical religious viewpoint, no matter how cleverly disguised the language that is used is. For example, Nicholas Wolterstorff, in another great little book called Reason Within the Bounds of Religion, explains that everybody, atheists, fundamentalist Christians, everybody has controlling beliefs. They're like the hardwiring of our thought system, and these are so deeply ingressed in who we are that we don't even know that they are controlling us. We all speak out of a worldview and a corresponding value system. We may not clothe it in theological language or even be aware that we have one, but we all have a guiding metaphysic, and a lot of it we just take for granted because they're so common. For example, most Americans eat meat, and we don't eat each other. And that's because we recognize a distinction between humans and animals. Most of us are okay. Even Duke University, as progressive as it is okay with certain kinds of animal testing that we would never allow on humans because we recognize there is a distinction between the human species and the other species of animals. That is a metaphysical judgment that we have made, and there are certain, not all by any means, but certain Darwinists that may disagree with that assumption. Most of us assume that our children are given to us to raise and to love, not to eat. That is not universally agreed upon in the animal kingdom. It's just an assumption that we live with. In contemporary issues, the women's suffrage movement was based on the idea that men and women were equal. Despite differences that people perceived at the time, they were still equal because they were both humans made in the image of God. Martin Luther King appealed beyond the current voting majority and the current laws to a higher law, which is that all men were created equal. Both sides of the abortion debate, if you listen to them, really are arguing values. One prioritizes the value of privacy and individual choice. The other argues the sanctity of human life, but both of them are inherently religious values. Because laws, for people to gain their legitimacy with people, have to appeal to a higher law. And I think everybody pretty much agrees with this. So I don't really know quite what she means when she says each law should be judged on its own merits. Because my question is, what merits? I suppose she means that each should be judged on how she feels about it or how many people agree with her. It's not really fair to claim that you're unbiased in an argument and then be biased. If you at least acknowledge your bias, that you have an equally controlling belief, then we're on equal playing field. Though this opinion is common, it seems to me to be inherently contradictory, and I think people abandon it when they are pushed. I saw a recent poll taken by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Research that asked the question, what should have the most influence on U.S. laws? Possible answers were will of the people, the Bible, or don't know. 60% of evangelicals said the Bible should be the most formative influence on laws. 91% of secular people said the will of the people. Now, if you push them on that, there becomes a problem because you say, what happens when 91% of the people think that black Americans should be subjugated? Well, you would say the will of the people is wrong, and our Constitution protects that. Take, for example, another case, the Nuremberg trials after World War II. The doctors that participated in these hideous, heinous crimes against Jewish people, on what basis were they tried? They were tried on the basis that it is wrong to kill humans even if your law is declaring that you have to do it. The question today about universal human rights, on what basis are we supposed to argue about universal human rights? Because maybe a certain society doesn't respect the same rights that we do. Not only can not recognizing that laws come out of a valuing, controlling belief or a metaphysic, it can lead to vicious abuses and heinous crimes. I would also suggest that it is just not historical in the United States. Mrs. Doniger's statement ignores the historical foundation of U.S. laws. Our founding fathers, on really not even that detailed of a search, recognized what they called the natural law tradition and its more precise interpreter, the Judeo-Christian ethic, and they were very clear about that. A great book in that regard is Michael Novak's new book, Washington's God. And he has ably demonstrated in a very scholarly way that America's founders, including Washington, Madison, and Jefferson, possessed a Judeo-Christian worldview on which they based the Constitution of the United States. Quotes are numerous. I mean, too many to read in this context, but just a couple to give you a taste of it. John Adams, the highest glory of the American Revolution was that it connected in one insoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. George Washington, farewell address. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail with the exclusion of religious principles. Congress's first act in 1787 was to ask President Washington to declare a day of thanksgiving to the Almighty for the Bill of Rights, which he did with the statement, this 26th day of November is devoted by the people of these states to the service of that great and glorious being who is a beneficent maker of all the good that was, that is, or that will be. Even Benjamin Franklin, men that reputed to be deistic, which Franklin was, of course, said in a letter to Ezra Stiles, the president of Yale, I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshiped, that the most acceptable service we can render to him is by doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal. These I take to be the fundamental principles of all sound religion, and I think the system of the morals and the religion of Jesus of Nazareth as he left them to us is the best the world has ever seen or is likely to see. A couple of professors from the University of Houston a few years ago did a study, a very comprehensive study of all the documents that surrounded the Constitution to decide what was it that informed the Constitution. They found that the Bible was quoted 12 times more than Montesquieu or Blackstone and 4 times more than John Locke. A third of all their quotes came from the Bible and another 60% from those who based their writings on the Bible. Finally, Earl Warren, who is not known to be a fundamentalist Bible banger Jerry Falwell follower or a predecessor, Supreme Court in the 1950s, regarded by many as being one of the most liberal of all the justices at the time, said in 1954, I believe that no one can read the history of our country without realizing the good book and the spirit of the Savior have been from the beginning our guiding geniuses. Whether we look to the first charter of Virginia or the charter of New England or several other things he mentions, he says the same object is present, a Christian land governed by Christian principles. I believe the entire Bill of Rights came into being because of the knowledge our forefathers had of the Bible and their belief in it. Freedom of belief or expression, of assembly, of petition, the dignity of the individual, the sanctity of the home, equal justice under the law, and the reservation of powers to the people. I like to believe today that we are still living in the spirit of that Christian religion. The point that I'm trying to make is that this American Constitution and the system of laws we have set up were like the structure of a house, the principles of which were built upon inviolable viewpoints that flowed out of the Judeo-Christian tradition as revealed in the Bible. In other words, the democracy in this country could not vote in Sharia. Sharia law. Muslims are free to participate in government, but they're not free to try to impose Sharia law on us. Many Muslim scholars will admit that this is a problem that some Muslims have because the Quran does not recognize the distinction between mosque and state. And some of the foundational ways they view the world are different. Muslims are welcome and encouraged to participate in the American system, but to do so, we ask that they adopt some of the values that go into the American Constitution. Skip through here. The idea of religious liberty, Michael Novak said, will not work within Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism because it depends on a duty to God, a creator who reads our consciousness and guarantees us liberty. These things they flow out of the Judeo-Christian worldview, and they're not just a contract. Again, this is what enables Martin Luther King to say, it doesn't matter what the will of the people is. It doesn't matter what the laws say. It doesn't matter what the president says. What matters is that these laws contradict the higher law. Harry Truman, our equality comes from the fact that we are created in the image of God. Alternatives to this system, being guided by a prevailing worldview, are frightening. I love how Newhouse says this, Richard John Newhouse. Because government cannot help but make moral judgments of an ultimate nature, it must, if it has in principle excluded identifiable religion, make those judgments by secular reasoning that is given the force of religion. He said, in other words, once abolished the God, the government must become the God. I once asked a Duke class, I was asked to lecture in here, if they agreed with this definition of freedom of religion. In order to ensure its citizens' freedom of conscience, the church in our land is separated from the state, the school, and the church. And they said, absolutely. That's Article 124 of the USSR Constitution. The Constitution we have was based on the Judeo-Christian framework, and so I think that using inherently religious language is inescapable from whatever viewpoint you come from. You're going to operate in that.
Dr. Hauerwas?
I can't help but point out that you've heard of Southern Baptists defend the power of the state. I want to concentrate on the line, do arguments from religious conviction, because such arguments are inherently irrational and necessarily exacerbate sectarian division in the United States and prevent meaningful public discourse. What worries me is because such arguments are inherently irrational, and on what basis you think you determine questions of rationality and irrationality. If Doniger does represent the position of John Rawls, it's very important to get clear on what John Rawls meant by public reason, against which everything else is understood to be irrational. He says, for example, in his idea of public reason revisited, the idea of public reason specifies at the deepest level the basic moral and political values that are to determine a constitutional democratic government's relation to its citizens and their relation to one another. In short, it concerns how political relations is to be understood. Those who reject constitutional democracy with its criterion of reciprocity will, of course, reject the very idea of public reason. For them, the political relation may be that of a friend or foe to those of a particular religious or secular community or those who are not, or it may be a relentless struggle to win the world for the whole truth. Political liberalism does not engage those who think this way. The zeal to embody the whole truth in politics is incompatible with the idea of public reason that belongs to democratic citizenship. Now notice what he therefore wants to bracket is any understanding of a comprehensive account of truthfulness in the public realm. Now he doesn't equate public reason with secular reason. He thinks those are two different things, though many people will think that his understanding of the public privileges the secular. Now, the reason that he wants public reason to have this character, I always think, well, the zeal to embody the whole truth in politics is incompatible with the idea of public reason. I always think, could we have a little? But behind this vision of public reason is a very strong picture of the achievement of modernity that has to do with the founding of the modern state associated with the Treaty of Westphalia. He says that Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th century, when the principle of toleration was honored only as a modus vivendi, this meant that should either party fully gain its way, it would impose its own religious doctrine as the sole admissible faith. A society in which many faiths all share this attitude and assume that for the indefinite future their relative numbers will stay roughly the same might well have a constitution resembling that of the United States, fully protecting religious liberties of sharply divided religious more or less equal in political power. The Constitution is, as it were, honored as a pact to maintain civil peace. So public reason is the way that you serve the development of the modern nation state to sustain relative order by training people who have comprehensive views about the world to keep them to themselves when it comes to public argument. He then says, Rawls originally was wanting to exclude religious speech in public, but then that seemed to make his account of public reason too close to an account of a comprehensive position. So he then comes up with, in the idea of public reason revisited, with this account of you can use religious speech in public only if in the long run you're able to put it in non-religious terms. He says, now we consider what I call the wide view of public political culture and discuss two aspects of it. The first is that reasonable comprehensive doctrines, religious or non-religious. Now notice he says there can be reasonable comprehensive doctrines, religious or non-religious, may be introduced in public political discussion at any time, provided that in due course proper political reasons, and not reasons given solely by comprehensive doctrines, are presented that are sufficient to support whatever the comprehensive doctrines introduced or said to report. Now, so you've always got to be ready if you are going to use any kind of comprehensive claims in the public, and that includes secular comprehensive claims, to be able to finally, in due course, make them proper political reasons. Now, which means that they are therefore going to be subject to the discipline of a public policy speech within the United States constitutional framework. That's rationality. That's his account of rationality. Now, what I want to challenge is that account of rationality as for the determination of what might count of as religious a speech. If you share, as I have been convinced, Alistair McIntyre's understanding of tradition-constituted rationality, then it's very hard to separate determinative religious speech from claims about the way the world is. If you do that, what you're liable to get is exactly the kind of irrationality of religious speech we're currently suffering from in this society, because it begins to look like that what people from strong religious traditions have to say is just shouting rather than they're being obligated to state the reasons why they hold what they do within the ongoing tradition of reasons that they thereby have learned to articulate across time. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have conflicts, but then why should you assume that a good society is one that is free of that kind of conflict? You can feel when Rawls gives you the religious conflicts of the past, you can feel the kind of desperateness of wanting to make sure that we don't result in killing one another over being Catholic or being Protestant. Instead, we end up killing one another over being First Amendment liberals and Muslims. So conflict can't be eradicated. It needs, as a matter of fact, each tradition to be encouraged to state its position with the clarity of its best representatives across time, which they themselves will exhibit arguments from within the tradition itself, which thereby enriches the kinds of arguments we need to be having between ourselves for sustaining genuinely a peaceful, conflictual society. In particular, and the one last point I would make, part of what Rawls requires is a strong distinction between the public and the private. And as part of the preservation of public reason as rational against the irrationality of strong religious and secular convictions. And the problem with the strong distinction between public and private is before long you find Christians saying things like, well, I believe Jesus is Lord, but that's just my personal opinion. What produces that kind of very odd locution that somehow or the other you think that your strongest convictions that should shape who you are private in a way that therefore it's now been turned into opinion in the name of public peace. What we need is a society with the confidence that we can respect one another in a manner that we don't expect. If this is a pluralist society, then why in the hell do you ask Jews, Christians, and Muslims to keep their convictions privatized? If it's pluralist, I would think that's a sign that you need, as a matter of fact, for them to articulate it in the most articulate fashion they can about why it is their deepest convictions shape the judgments they're making about X or Y. I'll end on this. A number of years ago, I was giving a lecture at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, and I can't remember what the lecture was about. But when I finished, one of their professors, who was a Protestant liberal, he had been educated by John Cobb at Claremont School of Theology, said to me, Hauerwas, your problem is you just don't give us any theory that will enable us as Christians to talk with Buddhists. And I said, I'm just so sorry, Jay. How many do you have here in Conway? And if you had a theory, what in the hell good would a theory do you? I just think you'd want to go say, what in the hell are you people doing here in Conway? The idea, Rawls seems to think you need a translation mode to have people that are Buddhist and people are Christian guaranteed to be able to talk to one another before they talk to one another. I don't think that's possible. So you just have to come from traditions. I mean, the question is not, do Christians want to talk to Buddhists, but do Buddhists want to talk to Christians because they don't think Christians have anything to say? So and on the whole, under the training of liberalism, Christians have pretty much turned out not to have anything to say. So exactly what I want to reclaim is an account of rationality that doesn't presuppose, simply because you're operating from historically complex religious traditions, that you are thereby a priori excluded from the public argument, because, one, I just hate that abstraction, public argument, as if that's something that happens in Washington and doesn't happen here.
Professor Lesnick.
Thank you. There's always an advantage and a disadvantage in speaking last. The advantage is you have plenty of things to think about while you're not having to talk. The disadvantage, of course, is that someone may say what you want to say. And happily, that hasn't happened. In a good way. I wasn't going to say anything about the newspaper writer. I usually don't talk to or about newspaper people. And I was going to say something about John Rawls. I hate to join in beating up on John Rawls for two reasons. One is, John Rawls, for all you might say about him, is, as philosophers go, in a class by himself. If you start listing philosophers, starting with Plato and ending in some guy who's been dead for 100 years, you'd list them, and then you'd probably add John Rawls. You might add some 19th century Americans or Englishmen. But he's truly a towering figure, and he's in a sort of our world. Now, that doesn't mean he always makes sense. I frankly have to confess that Socrates doesn't always make sense to me either. And the second part of the problem is that, without putting you on a pedestal, Dr. Hauerwas, you happen to have among you a towering figure of your own, who's not only an esteemed philosopher and theologian and teacher, but widely recognized as not exactly a class by himself, but a very small group. And by that I don't mean that nobody else agrees with him. So here I am. And not to speak to what do I say when I listen to a Baptist preacher preach, right? Which doesn't happen to me very often, you know. Anyway, here it goes. Some thoughts. First, about John Rawls. I do sort of wonder who he's writing to and what he's writing about. And it's certainly not, he's not writing for the Washington Post or even for you and me in some sense. But when he talks about the difficulty that religious speech has of being capable of producing universal assent, I just want, and I'm not a philosopher, I'm a lawyer, I'm a teacher. Compared to what? I mean, what is it in our history, going all the way back to Socrates, that has proven capable of producing universal assent? Well, lots of things are capable of it, but they never managed to do it. So it isn't as if Rawlsian philosophy or Platonic philosophy or McIntyre in philosophy is capable of producing universal assent. Nothing is capable. And with all due respect, neither is Christianity. It's no news to you, right? It does not produce universal assent. So I just don't get it. I don't get, whatever you think about religious speech in public life, I wouldn't say the problem is that it's not capable of producing universal assent. One of the occupational hazards of philosophers and of teachers generally and of lawyers, and when you get the combination, it's stunning, is they consciously or otherwise think, if you just let me explain it to you one more time, you'll agree with me. And we all know that's not true. As far as fueling discord goes, because religious talk is inherently sectarian and inherently irrational, I'm not going to try to comment on Rawls in light of Hauerwas on his own about what rationality is. To speak of something as sectarian sort of associates that word with religions. You know, I don't know what happens in your torts class or your contracts class or wherever it is that you get to realize that the debate is between deontological thinking and utilitarian thinking. Well, nobody calls those views sectarian, but that's just a usage that comes from history. A sect means a religious sect. You don't call Kantians a sect. Partly because they don't have meetings, they don't have uniforms, they don't have a tradition, they don't have robes, they speak English or German or whatever it is. So what fuels discourse? What fuels discord, apart from such standard notions as greed, envy, and the lust for power, what fuels discord is people yelling at each other and telling each other they're wrong. And a lot of religious people do that. And a lot of non-religious people do that. And all of that necessarily exacerbates division. So the cure for that has nothing to do, in my view, with whether you use religious language or not. I completely agree with both of you, I think, to the extent you say that it seems odd to say it's okay to have a religious reason for favoring A or B, so long as you don't disclose it. I don't want to argue with someone. I don't even want to talk with someone who doesn't tell me why they think what they do. If you don't want to tell me why you think what you do, that's fine. I don't insist. But let's not talk about it. I mean, because we're not talking about it. We're talking about some puppet that you put out there instead of it. But the only way you and I, Reverend, could talk to each other is to turn off the microphone. You guys could stay, but the more we were aware that you were here, the less likely we would be to get anywhere. Now, so what would exacerbate sectarian division? Well, one thing is an audience. The second is a desire to win an election or to make somebody else lose an election, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm being a little disorganized because I'm picking up on themes that have been given to me. You gave a wonderful example when you're talking about the distinction between humans and animals that we all agree with. Children are given to us to raise and to love. And then you said not to eat. Well, I'm going to pick out the first half, and I'm not using the point you were making or disagreeing with it. That is very much a 21st century statement. I think for most of the history of the world, and including the United States, although loving your children and raising them was important, the children were given to you to help you survive economically, to help on the farm, to help you live when you were no longer able to work and support yourself and there was no social security. That's what children were for. And that produced an awful lot of what we would call child abuse. The idea that your responsibility as a parent, your primary responsibility is as a parent to raise and love your children is a modern idea. Now, I think it's probably generally accepted. And the people who disagree with that keep their mouth shut. I don't imagine that there aren't people who think that it's oversold. So why do I use that example? To illustrate the absolute, to me, impossibility of finding universal agreement on anything of any significance, whether you're a Baptist or a religious person or an American or just a person. So all of these problems, it's not that I'm defending religion, certainly not, I just don't get seeing that that's the problem. I do get that in recent years particularly, there's been an awful lot of abusive dialogue that comes from religious people. But there's been a lot of abusive dialogue that comes from lots of other people. And when he says, or that's Rawls, that Stanley was quoting something, religious values may be introduced in certain circumstances. What forum is he talking about? Is he talking about sitting at the Harvard Faculty Club discussing something with a paleontologist? And can you introduce religion? Is he talking about writing op-ed pieces for the newspapers? Is he talking about presidential addresses? You know, what are the rules for introducing something in dialogue? It's so removed from the here and now interaction of people. So my religious values could be introduced in my talking to you if there were a lot fewer of you around and we knew each other for a while and we had a few things to drink, those of you who would do that. And then we might talk about it. But I'll be very tentative about it. I teach a seminar in which I encourage students to talk about the significance of their own religious upbringing and their current interaction with it, because many of them are refugees from their religion of origin. They may be coming back, they may be going, and they're thinking of themselves as lawyers, and encouraging them over the course of a semester in a group of a dozen people maybe to share honestly about that. You can't do that in a room like this. You can't do that in a book. Well, you can do it in a book, but you can't do it throwing books at each other. So when you say, was it Rawls who said this, or one of you? Forgive me.
It was Rawls.
Each tradition should be encouraged to state its position. I think that's wrong. I think every tradition should be encouraged not to state its position. I think every tradition, every member of a tradition should be encouraged to live out its tradition. My wife Carolyn is here, and she was helping me prepare, and I said, would it be inappropriate for me, I'm Jewish, as you probably know, to quote St. Francis? No, go ahead. So you all know it, and I'll close with this. St. Francis is reputed to have said, preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words.
Well, thank you all. Let me go ahead and get the second question on the table, and then maybe that will enable us to continue the conversations developing. Since at least the Ford-Carter presidential race and through the so-called culture wars, political strategists have been carefully considering polling data and demographics in determining whether and how their candidate ought to portray his or her religious convictions. Given the marketing-based strategy of most political campaigns, what sort of speech should religious voters expect from political candidates, and how should those voters evaluate the religious speech of candidates? And tying back to the first question, what effect does such speech have on the value of political and religious speech generally in our society? Should religious candidates remain silent about their convictions, flaunt them, or bring them up only if immediately relevant? And how would you determine that? Professor Lesnick, would you like to start?
Oh, you're not going to put me first.
I didn't want you to feel bad.
Yeah. The truth is, I don't have any interest in giving advice either to political candidates or to polling professionals about how to carry on their work. As the example shows, what polling experts tell political candidates is how to present themselves falsely to people who will fall for their falsity and elect them to office. And that's not an extreme statement. That's an absolute description of what they do. And, you know, I don't know how many of you are Republicans and how many are Democrats, but I'm not a Republican, so I'm delighted to see 3 leading Republican candidates for president, former governor of Massachusetts, a former mayor of New York, and a current very influential senator, furiously backpedaling from half the positions that they put out up to they decided to consult their polling data and to figure out what they, of course, they knew they can't become elected as to the presidency unless they can win enough Republican primaries. So, you know, I have nothing to say to those people, except, you know, does your mother know what you're doing for a living? But I don't want to say that. I mean, you know, my mother had some problems with what I do for a living. But so really, Jeff, I don't know how to be helpful to that. What you're hypothesizing, and you didn't write this, and I'm not criticizing whoever did, is given the fact that and I don't, you know, I'm not one of those people who sort of deifies George Washington. I think Abraham Lincoln was of a quality of president that for some reason the country never deserved but got once. But he too tailored what he did to get elected. And, who am I to argue with that? If he hadn't run for president, it'd be a worse world. But there are limits. There are limits. The idea that you do whatever you can to get elected, and then you forget about every promise you ever made in order to reward your friends or get reelected or start running for office or get your brother in a position to run for office, is absolutely appalling. And I have no rosy-hued look at the past. I mean, we have seldom had politicians with integrity. When the country was formed, an awful lot of the framers thought that democracy was impossible. I'm fond of telling my students, in 1800, in the state of New York, 1 out of 6 adult white males could vote, was eligible to vote. 1 out of 6 adult white males was eligible to vote. So that was the kind of democracy that the founders gave us. What they called democracy, a lot of them, was mob rule and demagoguery. And that's what we've got. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to saying that only, the sons and daughters of noblemen or large landowners should vote. I have no solution to that problem. But I just can't deal with that question. It seems to me to presume a state of corruption, and then it says, what would you do about it? Well, I have no answer to that.
Dr. Greear?
Yeah, I don't mean this to be pejorative, but it always amazes me how stupid some of the pundits think that the American populace actually is. Simply quoting God's name doesn't fool most Americans any more than Hillary Clinton donning a Southern accent makes people think that she was raised in a log cabin in Pulsford, Dale Earnhardt when he was alive. It's just a rose by any other name is still a rose, and I don't think many people are fooled by what this guy referred to here as, just, hey, tell your faith story, your faith journey. I fundamentally disagree with at least with the evangelical culture saying all they want is somebody to give God his due. I believe it's inescapable that there is a certain worldview that evangelicals work out of, as do all religious people, is the point I tried to make earlier. It's very fascinating to study the early church in this regard because if, the Bible is the standard of the church for ages, throughout end, then you're going to find a lot of similarities between Christians in every generation. Some differences, yes, but it's a lot of similarities. And if you study the early church, the Christians were a very odd group, politically speaking, if you even allowed it to put it in those terms. They've always been concerned about social justice. They were against the senseless militarism that was done in the name of empire. They were radically generous people. It said they always shared their table but never shared their bed. So it means they were Puritans. That's a little anachronistic, but they were Puritanish on their sexual mores. They were against homosexuality. They were against all forms of abortion, things that would put them off on either side of Republican and Democratic politics today. You had a certain set of worldview assumptions. And I think that what most Americans are looking for or want to see, I think they can see beyond this to, or at least I would like to think they could, to candidates that share their worldview. And that's where I want to take this question back to, is that I think it has to be honestly spoken. That it is just, for all the wrangling about let's not use the religious terms, a rose by any other name is still a term, a rose. And when you are arguing value and metaphysical principles, you are arguing religious values. Even the idea of the liberty of the conscience, which was earlier touted by one of our panelists as being something that we would encourage. Well, liberty of conscience comes from a particular view of God and humanity that not all religions share. You can find that out just by going to some of these countries. You can find it out by reading their writings. And so, once you push back farther and once you keep questioning and pushing, you're going to find a fundamental set of assumptions. Howard Kynes, a particularly bright professor, Marquette University. As far as I know, he's not an evangelical. At least I don't have any reason to think that he is. He says modern secular liberalism is what poses the great rival to Orthodox Christianity, the so-called culture wars that was referred to here. Most of the heat of the battle occurs where traditional religious believers clash with certain liberals who are religiously committed to secular liberalism. Secularism is religion because it is an organizing principle. This explains why talking about abortion or same-sex marriage, for example, with certain so-called liberals is usually futile. It is like trying to persuade a committed Muslim to accept Christ. He can't because his religion forbids it. He could only do so by converting from Islam to Christianity. He cannot accept Christ as long as he remains firmly committed to Islam. So it is with firmly committed liberals. Their religion forbids any concessions to the conservative agenda and worldview, and as long as they remain committed to their secular ideology, it is futile to hope for such concessions from them. So the point I'm trying to make is that real speech, when pushed back to where it is going to have a religiously inherent value. The question is, are you honest about it or are you not honest? As I mentioned, it's just not a fair debate when you claim that you're unbiased and the other person is biased, but your bias is actually causing you to say that they are the ones that are biased. The second part of the question that you read, sir, about the convictions. Well, if they're not going to talk about convictions, what is it that they are going to talk about? The central premise that I'm working from here is that to talk about laws without appealing to values is inherently illogical. It just cannot be done unless you want to just surrender to the will of the people. But even that, the will of the people is a value that people hold, not the will of the people plus the animal kingdom. You get to where you have to establish some type of understanding. Professor Lesnick, I understand that Christianity is not capable, I guess is the right term, of producing universal assent, but I don't think anybody's ever really claimed that. That's why the Bill of Rights was written by the American founders, because they knew there wouldn't be universal assent. You wouldn't have to have a Bill of Rights if everybody just assumed agreement on these things. And what they did is they set in place a structure and a framework. They built a house. And one of the foundational principles of that house was liberty of conscience. But what you were not allowed to do is go back and circumvent the Constitution. So you set up a court that would declare certain laws unconstitutional or not in line with the guiding principles that made up the United States, which were, they said, to be self-evident. Now, I understand and can sympathize with Professor Lesnick's hesitation on things that are universal, because it's very hard to find something that everybody agrees on. Yet the American document that we base our laws on says there are certain truths which are self-evident. So, the whole Constitution could be in error, and it might be. That's okay. It's not the Word of God, but this is the house that the American forefathers built. And so if you're going to participate in their system, you either need to get a new Constitution or you need to abide by the guiding principles that they gave. A number of things. That leads to the third question. How does the candidate determine when it is relevant? Here again, I think the Founding Fathers are very helpful. There's a balance. On one hand, they wanted to promote justice and good. On the other hand, they recognized that one of the greatest goods there was personal liberty. They believed that the Bible taught that liberty was the highest form of morality. So they said in issues of conscience and worship, there should never be any kind of laws. But they took other things such as the sanctity of life and in different areas and said this is where we will have laws that express our worldview, but it doesn't mean that every part of the Christian worldview is expressed in law. I think it's a sin to be lazy. I think it's a sin to have sex outside of marriage. I think it's I would think it's a sin to take the Lord's name in vain. But we know that liberty is to be preserved, and so you don't make laws on certain things because you want to promote that good of liberty, which is itself a value that arises out of the Judeo-Christian understanding of God and man. Bachevsky, Revenge of Conscience, says it like this. He says, even secularists impose a faith on others. They merely impose a different faith. Every law reflects some moral idea. Every moral idea reflects some fundamental commitment. And every fundamental commitment is religious. It proposes a highest good, a God. The important distinction is not between religion and secularism, but between faiths that do and faiths that do not demand the civil enforcement of all their moral precepts. So, to the question, should the civil law enforce the precepts of the faith, the biblical answer is some yes, some no. Which ones do you mean? The New Testament contains literally hundreds of precepts. However, Christianity on the whole is not a legislative religion. Christianity, as taught by the Apostle Paul, believes that the government was given as the minister of God to promote the social welfare and righteousness, and insofar that they do that and do not exceed their sphere of authority, they are operating as the very ministers of God. That is a strong statement, but it comes straight from the mouth of the Apostle Paul, or from his pen in Romans 13. And so when the government
Read
is...
Romans 12.
No, it's Romans 13.
I know, read Romans 12.
You don't have to do it now.
Good. I would love to know what you're thinking, or maybe that's a question for a later time.
Well, it says when people use Romans 13, they never think that that's exactly the text that German Christians used to serve Hitler. Secondly, they never read Romans 12:14 that says you are to submit to injustice, because by doing so, that is the way God would rule the world. Instead, they separate Romans 13 from Romans 12 in a way to justify political rule in a way that doesn't expect Caesar also to be repentant. So I just to separate Romans 13 away from Romans 12 is exactly the kind of move that produces Christians to be faithful servants of the state in a way that prevents us from being the kind of people that call the state into question.
Yeah, I would not say, in fact, I would say that this is not separating the context at all, because Romans 12 is how a Christian is to respond to the state when it is unjust. But then when he tells them to submit to them...
It doesn't say that. Let me see it. Injustice isn't used. It says...
It says evil, which is a synonym of injustice.
How do you know?
How do I know?
How do you know? How do you know? Evil's evil, justice is justice.
No, evil is a Hebrew
listen.
concept that flows out of the Old Testament law, which is a just law.
Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those that weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Then let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Now, never read Romans 13 without reading Romans 12:14, because then you begin to see that applies also to Caesar. Do not avenge. Do not avenge. And then you'll begin to get a sense of how Christians in America have failed to read Paul well because they want to read Paul as underwriting democratic presuppositions of government that assume somebody's got to kill somebody in the name of Jesus. Now, that's what I don't think Paul will let you do if you read Romans 12 in relationship to Romans 13. And that's the reason why it seems to me we have so little good religious discourse in this country, because most American Christians don't know how to read the Bible well. And they don't know how to read the Bible well because they're Americans before they're Christians. It is only when we recover the disciplinary forms of a people set apart who will say, no, it's not a war on terror, it was murder, and you don't go to war against murderers. It's only when American Christians are able to have their speech disciplined in that kind of way that we might be able to produce a candidate that could say something truthful. You're just not going to get it when you continue to underwrite the sentimentalities of the civil religion in the name of Christianity.
Dr. Greear?
Thank you. Dr. Hauerwas and I agree on something very fundamental, and that is the Christ-like disciples' response to evil or injustice or whatever you want to call it.
I assume you apply that to George Bush.
I feel like, I know in religious discourse the example is we need to hear each other out. So on Romans 13, you may not read it in separation from the context of Romans 12, but you have to read that whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear for the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Now, hold on. Paul said, Acts 21:25, when he was standing before Festus, he said, if I've done anything worthy of death, then let me die. Thus conceding that in his mind, that Caesar had the right to put him to death if he was worthy of it. That's the same thing he's saying here in Romans 13. You can't just cut out the fact servant of God to promote justice and righteousness. I understand Christ-like discipleship, what that implies. I understand what it means to not overcome evil with good. Not overcome evil with evil. But you have to you acknowledge that when Paul is interpreting these things, what he is saying is there is a right of the government as the minister of God to promote justice, and he uses the term sword and worthy of death. That is clear. But I really feel like that will get us off subject until a later time, so if I can come back there, and I'll give you plenty of time to have last word on that.
Do you want to get involved in this?
I wouldn't dream.
Can I finish this answer on this one, because without getting on that sidetrack, because I have one other thing I was going to say on that. Thank you. The question was, how do you determine when it is relevant? When you determine when it is relevant, the answer to that question of when it is relevant is
You mean religious speech by candidate?
religious speech by a candidate. Back to the question, is that on one side you've got freedom, on one side you've got order of the people, and I think that the relevance comes from when you determine what things are inherent in the American Judeo-Christian experiment, and then what things would violate the principle of the freedom of conscience. I believe that's how the Founding Fathers would have answered it too.
Let me suggest that we go ahead and let me ask the individualized questions of the three of you, and then I hope that will enable you to, and the audience also eventually, to continue this conversation. The first individualized question is for Dr. Greear. Can you give us your overview of the state of the Christian worldview in government? How do you see that worldview expressed or suppressed through specific governmental acts? For instance, you've said before that by refusing to allow creationism to be taught in public schools, the government is elevating one religion over another. Do you think, in light of the American value of separation of church and state, that secular schools should be permitted to teach creationism? And in what areas do you see the opportunity for expression of the Christian worldview by government?
My problem, again, with the way that that question is phrased is that the quote, secular schools should be permitted to teach creationism, which is an inherently religious idea, as if teaching evolution was not in itself an inherently religious idea. If you take any number of people, Richard Dawkins, George Gaylord Simpson, Julian Huxley, on what evolution is, it's a naturalistic and a materialistic process that accounts for the entire history of life. That sounds like physical science. But then it says, and excludes design or ultimate purpose. That is a metaphysical statement. So the idea that this particular view is not metaphysical and thus equally religious is just not being honest with what a worldview actually does. Even guys that I enjoy reading, Charles Krauthammer said in a recent Time magazine article I read, and I was really surprised that he said it. He said, science demands the assumption that all things arose by chance and necessity. He says that it demands that assumption. That is an a priori assumption that flows out of a worldview. Our a priori assumptions should be discarded when approaching a scientific question, whether that assumption is there's a God or there is no God. All evidence should be evaluated with an open mind, whether it points to a certain theory of design or whether it points to random chance. Atheism is certainly as metaphysical a belief as theism. George Wald, professor emeritus of biology at Harvard, a winner of the Nobel Prize in biology, made a statement in the Scientific American, which is one of the premier scientific journals in America. He said there are only two options as to how life arose. One is spontaneous generation leading to evolution. The other is a supernatural creative act of God. There is no third possibility. Spontaneous generation, that life arose from non-living matter, was scientifically disproven by about 120 years ago by Louis Pasteur and others. That leaves us with only one possible conclusion, that life arose as the supernatural creative act of God. I will not accept that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible, spontaneous generation leading to evolution. Is this the unbiased science which Krauthammer wants us to dogmatically hold to? And I, for one, am tired of having Darwinians shove their religion down everybody's throat as if that's the only one. Or say that it's not religion. Secularism teaches nature's God. They believe in the separation of church and state so long as the separation of your church from the state. Darwinism is to them a matter of faith. It's the true church. It's immunized from argument. You shall have no other gods before it. There's just a number of things that show it is as equally a religion as what the others are bringing to it. Now, the dilemma it leaves us in is that how do you teach a subject like science without getting into some metaphysical views? It's just impossible. You can't do it because at some point you try to explain the facts that are in front of you. And that's where I would say that the whole public school system is kind of a question on the original American experiment, because how could you have a public school in a way that wasn't forced to teach a certain type of religious viewpoint and blur that line between what is law and what is right and teaching worldview and creating worship. There's a number of examples that I believe that if you looked at the Founding Fathers, they would not view what's going on in the public school in the right way. There's, the U.S. Congress, the openings that they do in prayer, that the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional recently for students to read those prayer. Let's see. The original John Marshall, Supreme Court Justice, who said that he thought that the studious perusal of the Bible would make better citizens, and he encouraged its reading among all young people in schools everywhere. I know there's the big question about the separation of church and state, but you've thrown something into the equation, which is the public education of children, as if it is the state that is supposed to educate our children and not local communities of parents. That creates something that the Founding Fathers didn't know, and now you have a dilemma on your hands. I honestly don't know what the answer is, but I know that teaching one religion at the exclusion of the other is not really the way. Since we're in the place of that type of system, we've got to cope with it, but I think we should all be honest that a metaphysic is what's guiding a statement like undesigned purpose, no chance, and it's equally as religious as anything else.
Professor Lesnick, comment?
Well, I'll only say this. I mean, I think you put your finger at the end on a very real problem, and that is the founding generation did not contemplate universal public education. And some people, they don't think it's a very good thing, which is a different question. And I completely agree with you, there's no way out of it. Whether creationism solves the problem is a whole different story. The problem is much broader than that, and I think you agree with that. I do have a funny reaction that's so complicated, I don't think I can explain it. It's the second time you've made this point. That is, people criticize secular thinking. People who claim to be religious criticize secular thinking on the ground that it's really religious, that you have a religion. And so, and I kind of, and I've been trying to figure this out actually. What's their point? If they think religion is good, why is it bad to have a secular belief, which is a religion? Well, you can say, well, okay, you're not admitting you're biased. But I'm not sure that the religious guy is admitting he's biased. He's admitting or saying or proclaiming that he has certain fundamental premises. And you're saying so does everybody else. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. That's sort of, in a different way, what I was saying initially. The problem I have, and it's not a problem with you, it's much deeper than that. I mean, it's much broader than that. It's not deeper than you, it's broader than you and me, is that if all values are religious, in quotation mark, and if religion, in quotation mark, forbids any concessions, as you said, why are we talking? What's the point of discussing our differences? We just differ, so okay, I like Camembert and you like Roquefort. We don't throw it at each other and we don't go to war. But, I think that there are Protestant churches that do not believe that all abortion is sinful. Forget about whether it should be illegal. I completely agree with you about the hesitation that religious people should have in enacting their view of sin into positive law. But putting that aside, there are religious denominations that have a totally different view on abortion than most people seem to think that most religious people have. And that doesn't mean anyone's wrong, but given that all of these views, whether they're called religious, secular, philosophical, political, or what, are based on premises that, as to which concessions are forbidden, what are we talking about? Let's either just take a vote or go to war or I don't know what. But discussion, that's why it seems to me a blind alley.
Dr. Hauerwas?
Well, I never used the language of religion because it was the creation of 18th century Protestant liberals to try to show you can't avoid it, so why don't you try some of mine? The language of religion as a universal characteristic of the human turns out to play right into the hands of a Feuerbachian account that religion is just the projection of human desires. And so I think you ought to stay away from the category. I don't like the language of values. It was basically out of the 18th century that names subjectivistic, arbitrary desires which you cannot argue about. It comes from economic formations that want to put a value on commodification. I don't have any religious convictions, and I certainly don't have any values. I have strong convictions which I take are true, and I'm ready to argue about them. I think, therefore, that the way that has shaped American public, those kinds of terms have shaped American public discourse, ensures that we don't become articulate about how our differences need to be put in a manner that we might recognize them as differences. I think the issue of public education in America in that regard, the difficulty about public education is it's not education, because it's simply not clear how you have coherent reading from one year to another among a people, some of who say you can't read The Wizard of Oz because there are no good witches, and some people that say you can't read Macbeth because it's patriarchal literature that's demeaning to women. So how do you educate students in an ongoing mode of rationality that determines why some books should be read in relationship to other books as an ongoing tradition of inquiry? As a result, we train students to become mad. That is, to believe that by the time they've been educated in the American educational system, that finally they have to make up their own mind, and then they discover they don't have any mind worth making up. So I think that our educational circumstances are more problematic than simply the question of how you have strong religious convictions represented in our so-called educational institutions. My own language is that I don't think we ought to call public education public. It's basically a private education for the formation of people to be faithful servants to the status quo.
In that regard, Dr. Hauerwas, maybe we can introduce the question, which is particularly addressed to you. Jeffrey Stout, the philosopher, has recently suggested that you don't see liberal democracy as a traditional moral discourse and yourself as situated within it. You have a broad readership, you write in a liberal society, readers in a liberal society, both Christians and non-Christians accept parts of what you do and say and dismiss other parts. In short, your readers take your work and atomize it for their own purposes. They behave as actors in a particular community and tradition. Is that an accurate criticism of your position?
Well, I'd like to be able to control readers, but I can't. I think that it's interesting that how it is, if you're concerned with producing people of virtue rather than values, then it means that once we were interviewing someone to direct a program at Duke in ethics, and she was wanting very much to get students involved in social justice. And I said, well, my wife and I have been very involved with the Wesley Fellowship here. And for a number of years, those students that have come through that formation did not go out and get jobs, but went to work for the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, went to work for the Mennonite Central Committee, et cetera, went to serve L'Arche, and so on. And they do so because they understand that that's their way to serve Christ. And she said, well, I would never want to judge anyone's motivation. And I said, they don't understand it to be a motivation. They think it's a description. Now, if you're interested in the formation of people in virtue, then you don't separate motive from the description of the action in the way that we're taught to do it. And that seems to me exactly one of the problems with what we've been talking about in terms, if you come to the public and you can't use the language that shapes your life for its intelligibility, and you must find some other language, then you create a moral psychology that makes it very hard for the formation of people in virtue. That is always been one of my primary concerns about how liberal psychology wants you to be one thing in one aspect of your life and another thing in another aspect of your life. And that exactly defies our ability to have complete lives. And that's the kind, but good polities depend on the production of people with complete lives who are not different than they say. And so I think that's what democratic commitment should be about, is producing people who are not different than they say, because that's the way we discover goods in common that would otherwise be undiscoverable if we were not prepared to have our lives exposed by one another for the good of the common good. What, if you notice, liberalism won't give you is the language I just used, common good. Because instead, what you get is the language of common interest. And the reason you get the language of common interest is it is assumed your life is determined by arbitrary desires across time, which you want to get more of yours fulfilled than someone else's gets their fulfilled. If you use the language of the goods, then, as a matter of fact, you're in a different political context than the language of interest. And the law should serve the language of the goods. I think it makes sense that that's where it gets its intelligibility. So, of course, I understand, the idea that liberal democracy is a tradition. Obviously, it's a liberal tradition. But then Jeff Stout, who criticizes me, he's got to wrest liberal democracy from Rawls and put it in Whitman and Emerson's tradition. Now, that will be a trick if you can do it in the world in which we find ourselves. I'll help him because I prefer Emerson and Whitman to Rawls. But that's a debate within the liberal tradition, which I'm more than ready to enter in. Look, my problem, though, is never with liberals. Liberals should be liberals. Given the world in which we find ourselves, hell, that's probably about as good an alternative as you can get for public life. I just hate it when Christians think that discourse is their primary discourse. Namely, Christians become liberals. That's what bothers me in a way that we misdescribe our own convictions.
Let me go ahead and ask Professor Lesnick a question, because it does connect up with some of the things Dr. Hauerwas was saying. You've written, Professor Lesnick, that the words religion and obligation have a common root meaning to bind, and that this obligation does not pertain only to the sectarian observances of one's faith, but is salient throughout one's daily life, most especially the world of work. And you've urged society to allow lawyers greater latitude to act in their professional capacities according to their authentically held religious convictions, which I take it is at least somewhat similar to Dr. Hauerwas's point about being who they say they are. In entering the world of work, can we really live that out, though? What about the public high school teacher who shares the gospel with her students, or the medical doctor who feels compelled by conscience to administer a lethal but so far illegal dose of medicine in accordance with her patient's wishes, or the president who bases a decision to go to war in part on personal religious conviction?
Oh, you stopped there? Okay.
Question mark.
Yeah, well, as I said before, I didn't say this before. I teach professional responsibility. Most of you are law students, right? A lot of you are law students. So you have to take professional responsibility. As somebody said, it wasn't me. What course in professional responsibility really is a course in professional non-responsibility. And the basic mantra is you're not responsible for the consequences of your work as long as you do a good job. Your responsibility is to protect your client. And I think there's a deep problem about that for most law students, but particularly for religious law students, because of this integrity notion, this idea that whatever binds you to your faith commitments doesn't only bind you on Sunday, but the rest of the week, to put it the way lots of people have. And so that's a difficult question, because I think the young people you're talking about, Stanley, who work for the JVC. I've known a lot of them. They're marvelous people. Very few of them make a career out of that, which is not a criticism of them. My students, facing a world in which some of you probably know this, the New York law firms are now offering $160,000 a year for beginning associates, $160,000 a year. So what do you do in that world? And of course I don't know. I regard it as my good fortune that I didn't live in that world. When I decided to follow one route rather than another, the difference in pay was not that great. But the question of how you live out your obligations, whether they come from your religious convictions or anywhere, in a world in which you have to make your way, is a very hard question. And it's a very difficult one for a teacher to prod students about. So the issues that I would like to think about are not so much these problems. They're very important problems for public high school teachers, medical doctors, and presidents. But the most salient problems are problems for law students and lawyers, at least in my life. And it goes like this. The article that quotation was taken from had to do with a Roman Catholic lawyer who was appointed by a judge to represent a teenage woman who needed a judicial bypass to get, not a surgical procedure, to get an abortion, which under the state law she had to get. And he was appointed as counsel to represent her. And he asked the Bar Association of his state, which was Tennessee, not far from here, whether it would be improper for him to try to get out of that or to counsel her about it or anything like that. And they said yes, it would be improper. And that was the jumping off point for my discussion. But that's not the major problem facing lawyers with respect to reconciling their faith convictions or any other convictions and their work. And Tom Schaefer, Dr. Hauerwas and I were discussing him, has said this. The major problem for a lawyer in today's world is what he calls, and I think he comes out of, I don't know if it's a Catholic tradition, I
He's
think
Roman
it is.
Catholic.
Yeah, no, I know that, but it's complicity in evil. That is that is putting it in a way that, only a theologian would put. You are complicit in the evil that your client is doing. It's as simple as that. But the law tells you, no, you're not, because that's your obligation, that's your oath. If you ever saw Billy Budd, that's what Billy Budd is about. He took an oath to join the Navy and support the Queen. So he sends somebody who's innocent to his death because he's obligated to support the Queen. So put it that starkly, first of all, what am I doing? Bothering a lot of students about how they're going to live their life, and that bothers me. But that's the issue. That's the issue that I think is presented by anybody who takes his or her religion seriously. And he said this, and he's a Roman Catholic. He said, the issue is not abortion. How often do you get, as a lawyer, not a doctor or a nurse, to be involved with abortion? It's how often do you help a company to do somebody out of something which they're legally entitled to do, maybe, if they manipulate the system enough, but which in justice they really should pay over, and a whole string of things like that. So that's my answer. I don't know if that's an answer.
Dr. Greear, comments on either Dr. Hauerwas or Professor Lesnick?
Is this like closing comments?
Well, they both had questions. You haven't had a chance to respond.
I think my question, somebody has to define, in Dr. Hauerwas's terms, what the goods are. I think where I find the most difference I have with Professor Lesnick is in saying that we cannot agree on certain universal things poses two problems. One, it completely neuters my voice to speak about universal human rights. It takes away all justification for the Nuremberg trials. It really undermines the entire American experiment that these things are self-evident. I agree that democracy is a pitiful form of government, and democracy ends up being simply one person trying to vote another person out of their money. I think it was Alexander Tyler, who said in a book called The Athenian Revolution that democracy exists until the people figure out they can vote all the money out of the government into their own pockets. So in order to have a democracy, what you have to have is you have to have a guiding principle behind it that legislates what is allowed and what is not allowed within the will of the people, where the will of each other cancels each other out, but you've got to have a guiding principle. And in the American case, historically, it is the Judeo-Christian principle expressed in the Constitution. That's the house, that's the structure. Therefore, to hearken back to that and say, yes, these things come from the Bible. You are free to come here and exercise whatever religion you want to and practice it as freely as you want to within these parameters because this is the Constitution. If your religion calls for you to eat your children, you cannot do that here. If it calls for you to have 4 wives and beat them, you cannot do that here. This is the foundation on which we have, and so that's where I would see maybe the difference in the approach that we're taking.
Thank you. Let me
just go on
sure,
record.
go ahead.
I don't believe in universal human rights. I mean, I think America is the only country that's had the disadvantage of being founded on a philosophical mistake, the notion of inalienable rights. And we've been bedeviled by that ever since. It's a big problem.
Well, let me invite the audience now to participate in a less passive fashion. Are there questions for the panelists? Yes.
For any of the panelists, setting aside for a moment the arbitrary distinction between public and private discourse, a great deal of the discoursing that goes on in a forum where we can all, hear it, read it, participate in it in a way, has to do with forming policy. So how does the expression of your religious beliefs in discourse translate into forming policy? For example, Dr. Greear said that he would not make a law forbidding laziness or swearing. But why do his religious views, publicly expressed here, not influence that policy?
Well, the balance that I was saying that we had to hold is a very important religious view of mine, which I get from the Bible, is the liberty of conscience. One place where Dr. Hauerwas and I would disagree is that I believe that the government is commissioned by God to keep order and peace, and sometimes it uses the sword to do so. So laws are to be passed in order to promote those ends. And you have to balance, will this take away liberty unnecessarily? If every time I swore, or Dr. Hauerwas swore, maybe 9 people died, we would make a law against swearing. And so you would say, okay, yeah, his personal liberty does not help the fact that, your sexual preferences, you say, well, that's a private matter. Well, if you like to rape children, that becomes a public matter. So you say your liberty of conscience is affecting another held value, and it's always a tension, and I believe it's the cause for rigorous debate. Homosexual marriage is one, that you got some questions about. Is the right of people to privately choose their own lifestyles, does that exceed the necessity to keep a fundamental structure in society of marriage and family? And it's grounds for a good debate. I know that's not what we're here to debate tonight, but it's a great debate. So I think you have to hold those things in tension, and I believe each incident you'll discuss.
The other panelists? Anything?
Well, I represent a form of Christianity that doesn't think its first task is to rule. So what I would like to produce are people who will not think that their first task is to form public policy, but rather to be a kind of people that means that certain kinds of things that are not public policy might become so. In a way that, for example, if Christians are Christians, we should surely be able to make the question of income distribution in this country a matter of discussion. Why should a first-year associate in a New York law firm make $160,000 a year. People that are picking up the trash deserve that, not people doing the law. So how you make certain questions issues of policy already presupposes a kind of coercive position I don't necessarily want to take. For example, I don't think it's a constitutional matter how to determine marriage law. It's not in the Constitution. It is part of the cultural habits that are now no longer intelligible given the change of the ethos of our society. I wonder, as a matter of fact, I mean, I'm deeply committed as a Christian to lifelong monogamous fidelity as an understanding of marriage. I have no idea why anyone else in this society should be committed to that. So why don't we just make marriage part of business law and do it under limited contract? As a Christian, I have no reason to think that I should necessarily oppose that. I mean, why should I want the state to underwrite my way of life? So it becomes very complex given my general sense that Christians have to get over the idea that this is a Christian society. And when we do that, then we may discover we have the freedom to serve our non-Christian brother and sister in a way that provides imaginative alternatives to a better way of life than when we're trying to protect a way of life we can no longer justify to the wider public.
Another question? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
It's been very interesting hearing all the different points of view, and I'm seeing so many different paradigms there. And I just want to ask the question to each of you, what do you think is at stake here in this forum, in this discussion? I'm imagining that you're going to have different answers.
What's at stake?
In this conversation?
Yeah.
Well, I think you have more to offer on that than I or we do. Why are you here? I don't mean that rhetorically. I think what's at stake. Well, let me try. I mean, I think what's at stake is that religion is about what really matters, the way the universe is put together and what we're doing in the world. I don't know, that's probably a better way of putting it, but something like that. And it's of very great importance. And although, you know, most of you are Christians nominally, and whatever that means to you, most people in this country are, I think, most people in the world, it's the largest religion if you count them all together. And yet, we don't know how to live together. And in recent years, for reasons that are much too complicated to boil down, the responsibility of religious speech for that difficulty has come to the fore. I think we all agree that probably is misplaced, but I think there's sort of no more important question than what's the relation between how you think about why you're in this world and how the world is put together, and how you want to live your life, and how you think the polity that you're a part of should carry itself out. So is that why we're here? To struggle with that, I think.
Dr. Hauerwas said a moment ago that he represents a Christianity whose first desire is not to rule. I could not agree more. I'm a pastor of a church. Our church will never go to war. Our church will never imprison somebody. Our church will never execute laws and justice of any type. We will compel, we will persuade, we will proclaim truth. When we meet those who want to kill us, we will lay down our lives. That is the Christianity of which I am a pastor. However, I also recognize that there is another divinely ordained institution, and that is the institution of government. As a Christian, I believe that institution flows from the Bible. I believe it is divinely ordained. I believe that's why it's called a minister of God. I believe it is not the same as the church. This is one point of disagreement I have with the otherwise brilliant Dr. Hauerwas. I think that he does not recognize the distinction between those two, that I'm a minister of God and so is the policeman. What's at stake for me is really not the church. One day the kingdoms of the world will become the kingdom of our God in Christ, and there's not a thing I can do to stop or help that. And I know that that's coming. But I also know that there is divinely ordained institutions to prohibit evil. That's what Paul said. And I have a daughter that's growing up. She's 4 years old, another one that is 2. And I want to see people who would harm her, I want to see them put into correctional places. I want to see justice promoted. And I believe that, yes, sometimes it is the preaching of the gospel that Christ died for us that changes people's hearts. But I also know that there is a role for, and God in His wisdom instituted another institution, and that was the government. And I believe we have to be rigorous in our discourse about what laws ought to be, where they get their foundation, and who has the right to enforce them. So I believe this is all an inherently religious discussion.
So you're seeing good government and salvation as inextricably tied together?
Oh, not at all.
No.
No, I'm sorry if I communicated that. I didn't mean to. What I am preaching is salvation. I'm pointing people toward the kingdom of Christ, which will come. We live in a handicapped world where there are a lot of sick people. And yes, the ultimate healing for them is found in the gospel of Jesus. That's why I'm a pastor. I used to want to be a lawyer to represent criminals before the judge. Now I represent the judge before criminals. I know that that's what I am doing, is I am proclaiming the gospel. However, in the midst of this handicapped world, God instituted other things to keep and promote peace. This is in the long history of the church. Luther and Calvin and Augustine and pre-Constantine and post-Constantine and all throughout the church, there's been relative agreement that good government has the right to imprison, it has the right to promote justice and to execute even with the sword if possible. I know that is wildly offensive to my brother sitting here to my right, and that's where we will disagree, but that's my personal stake in it.
How do you know when it's good?
I believe that's what the worldview of Judeo-Christian is. I know it's not good for someone to rape my daughter. Would you dispute that?
No, I wouldn't dispute that.
Well, then, so we agree that there could be a good.
We can make discriminations, but do I need...
But we both agree that raping my daughter is not good.
Well, but look...
Because that's very important to me right now.
Look, of course, you understand that the rapist has also been saved by Christ.
There will be no rape in heaven, and what Christ has saved will go into heaven.
Right, but I take it that then the question becomes, how big a government do you need to provide legal remedy against rapists?
I would love to have that discussion. That's what I've been trying to get through the whole night.
Well, do you need a Pentagon?
I don't know if either one of us is in the American workings enough to say that we should have a hexagon or an octagon.
No, let's don't be clever. Do you need a Pentagon? I mean, how big an army do you need to maintain basic civility in a designated community?
Large enough to stop Hitler.
How did Hitler get to be Hitler?
He wasn't an American. He could not have been elected and done what he did in our country unless he abridged and violated the Constitution.
Well, as a matter of fact, he was democratically elected.
I know that, but they didn't have. He would have had to do it in contradistinction to the American Constitution. They could do that. That could happen in our country, but it could not happen if the Constitution was honored. And that has been my point. We have to honor the Constitution.
How do you know it hasn't? How do you know it hasn't happened?
I'd be happy to talk about that.
I mean, you and I are white guys. If you're not white, you got a different problem about knowing it hadn't happened. Bajetsky, who you've quoted several times, wants to provide a natural law account of how you preserve the rule of law in a way that doesn't entail a strong theological convictions as first-order speech. Now, if you want to develop a natural law justification, which has an honorable history, then you're going to need, then some of the kind of rhetoric about Judeo-Christian you have to discipline, because you're not going to appeal to ultimate religious warrants to give yourself a kind of discriminating mode of discourse to say, I can appeal to fundamental natural law normative presuppositions which most people should agree to in order to sustain this kind of justification. I think that's, and it would be interesting if we could get that kind of discourse going. I mean, what you find in the kind of neoconservatives that you're quoting, Mike Novak and Richard Newhouse, are people that want it both ways. I mean, at once they want to maintain a kind of natural law argument for the American legal system, while at the same time argue that this is a country firmly rooted in, which I take to be a historical argument that is quite problematic, that a country rooted in Judeo-Christian convictions, and I hate that phrase, Judeo-Christian. I mean, Jews hate it, and I don't blame them. In order to sustain America still understood as fundamentally a Christian enterprise. And I think that's all quite problematic, not only at the formal level, between the natural law and the theological, but also just historically.
Professor Lesnick?
Stanley, in your own way, I think you want to have it both ways, too. I mean, I have enormous respect for what I understand is your theology. But when you say that you'd love to see a conversation about why the guy who picks up trash doesn't make the money that the first-year associate is, you're giving up the game.
Oh, well.
And just let me say one thing. I mean, you probably know Andrew McThenia.
Who?
Andrew McThenia.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I mean, he says, and he's close to your tradition.
Right.
All you need to do is live the way Jesus told you to live, and all you have to do is love God and your neighbor. You are not responsible for the distribution of income.
Right.
You should avoid trying to.
Right.
You're not responsible for the prevalence of rape.
Right.
That's a
No.
fallen world, and you live in a redeemed world, and you can only do what you can do. And some people can tolerate that, and I have the incredible admiration for them. But most of us can't.
Well,
Let me take another, excuse me, sir. Let me take another question.
Yeah, you know, I wish you had invited a secular humanist or somebody from the ACLU to balance out your panel. I really don't agree with the assumption that morality necessarily comes from religion. We have 30% of our population that doesn't go to church on Sunday, another 14% who call themselves non-believer, and depending on the poll, another 3% who are atheists. I would submit that if you took a group of secular humanists and compared their morality to Christians, that they'd come out pretty well. And furthermore, I think calling naturalism a religion is a canard. Naturalism through science is the closest thing that we really have to truth. And I would recommend that if you're concerned about the Constitution, Mr. Clergyman, you read the Dover trial. If you're concerned about self-organization, You ought to update your reading on the progress that's been made on the self-generation of life. That's what I have to say.
I'm not sure I heard a question. Let me take another question. That's awesome.
I was going to ask Professor Hauerwas, given that we live in a pluralistic community and even beyond, outside of the Christian community, I was formed sitting at the feet of women theologians and gay theologians and priests who do not have anything in common in terms of, or very little in common in terms of what the good represents with people like Falwell and Haggart. So how do we act in democratic communities to create a life that is conducive to virtue? Do we have to give up the field as soon as we're pushed to coercive means, or is there a more nuanced sort of engagement in that?
Well, the way I always answer that is to say you have to do it the way porcupines screw, very carefully. I can't answer that in principle because if I answered it in principle, I would become a ruler. You just have to try in the discussions you're given. That's the reason I don't want. I'm not withdrawing. I want to be as present as I can be, if you'll let me. I mean, I'm a pacifist. I want to try to ask what kind of community do we need to be that we can have people called to the police function that don't have to wear weapons. I'm more than ready to enter into that. I'm ready to find commonality where I can with that. You can't, you don't start a political argument in the abstract. You got to find people where they are. Now, I don't know, people, the problem with the religious right in this country, it seems to me, is they just know so little about Christianity. and that how, about the question of what would it mean for someone to be articulate as a politician in the public realm. Well, think about if they had really read Augustine's Confessions and they were asked about their faith in God, they'd say, I'm on a journey that my faith tells me my first act is to say, I'm not sure where I am. Now that, that would be a kind of chastened discourse that has conviction.
Another question?
Yes. I just have a question, Dr. Stanley. I can't pronounce your last name. It's just related to your last statement that you're willing to have a discussion about getting to a society where we have policemen who don't have to carry weapons. And I think it's a good discussion to have and a very valid discussion to have. But do you think such a world, given the hindsight of history, like such a world is even possible?
It was in England. Don't forget, the British Bobby didn't carry guns. Now, you may say, well, that was a far too homogeneous society, so it won't work anymore. Well, let's see. How could we, I always think, I got when we had the police riot at the Democratic Convention, when Hubert Humphrey in Chicago, you don't remember any of this. I remember, I thought at the time, the hippies and the police beat one another up, and the police were all dressed in, gun belts and helmets and this kind of thing. And I thought, and people said, well, we need to send them to college where they will become more humane. And I thought, no, we need to dress them like British bobbies. I mean, how could you call a British bobby a fascist pig? We just need to start trying to be more imaginative with about how we approach these kinds of matters, because as long as you say, well, the only answer is the gun, that's the only answer.
Given the hour, let me ask Dr. Greear and Professor Lesnick if they have closing thoughts they'd like to.
Yeah, I'll respond specifically to that comment there. No, I don't think that world is possible until Christ returns. I believe that, there is coming a day when we will beat our swords into plowshares. I believe no Christian in the meantime should be a hawk, but we ought to be heavily armed doves, because there are people who would do that, and I believe that is divinely ordained. There is in philosophy, there's a story that gets tossed around a lot about a guy named Pythagoras, who, in this Greek myth, he makes a monster, and he makes a bed for the monster to lay on. But when he gets the two made, alas, the monster is longer than the bed, so he cuts off the monsters at the knees so it will fit the bed. And the moral of the story is, no, lengthen your bed, don't shrink your monster. Mm-hmm. And what it means is that when you have a theory that doesn't explain all the facts, the natural phenomena, whether those be biblical facts or empirical facts, you need to lengthen your theory. I admire the Christ-like willingness to yield to persecution that Dr. Hauerwas pushes forward. I believe that it is certainly part of Christian discipleship. However, there were parts of the Bible and parts of our experience, both of which say that is not possible and it is not right. And so when I have those two things, both the Word of God that clearly tells me that there are ministers of God for justice who bear the sword, when Paul understands that, then I understand that we have a divinely ordained institution called government. Abraham Kuyper was so clear on this, and he was not a Jerry Falwell. He was in the Netherlands. And he said there are spheres of authority in the Bible. There is the family, there is the church, there is the government. And each must know what its sphere is, and the Bible yields that.
Let's
Sure.
probably not get back onto the exegesis of Romans. Professor Lesnick, would you like to have the final word on it? It doesn't have to be in response to the question.
Well, it is striking to me that here you have two people who are very learned and very steeped in their tradition who read it differently. And when I hear, and being standing outside of that tradition, as I do, but having studied it and have a lot of respect for it, I can see value in each of your readings of the scriptures, and I recognize that I'm drawn to one more than the other. It doesn't matter which one. And I think that just plays out what goes on probably for all of us. And it goes back to the question of universal assent. That is, we are different, not in our religious avowals, but after all, the difference between you two, somebody walking in the room could say, well, it depends on whether you like Romans 12 or Romans 13. That's pretty sectarian division, right? It's intra-sectarian, right? So we are who we are, and the moral for me is that you should, one, try to be who you are, be authentic, but two, don't act the way you sort of have to act if you're sitting up here, people throwing things back and forth at each other and at you. But listen to the people who are who they are and who are different from you, and see if there's a piece of them that speaks to you.
Let me express my own personal thanks, and let's, if you will, join me in.